Ellie!
Xenomorph Gene Planet, the planet that changes DNA to turn every living organism into a horrifying xenomorph. A few years ago, Dark Horse Comics released a series of comics under their Fire and Stone series. It essentially tried to bring the Alien, Predator, and the Prometheus franchises under one umbrella, and Dark Horse did a pretty good job at that. Aliens Fire and Stone deals with a group of survivors from the exomoon of LV-426, which was the same moon where Ellen Ripley goes in James Cameron's Aliens. The survivors are led by Derek Russell, the de facto in charge of Hadley's Hope, the terraforming colony on LV-426. However, when they crash land on LV-223, they find unspeakably horrific beasts, including a horde of xenomorphs that are hunting the survivors one by one. LV-223 was also the resting place for many unfortunate souls from Ridley Scott's Prometheus.
Yeah, baby.
But there are things much worse than xenomorphs. Derek learns that the moon's biosphere has undergone millions of years worth of evolution in just about 90 years. So, how did this happen? Well, that's what we are about to find out. In this video, we will explore all 4 issues of Aliens Fire and Stone and learn about the LV-223, a hostile celestial body where every living being undergoes horrific mutations. So, let's begin, shall we? Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. The Onager. At 9:15 in the morning of July 3rd, 2179, the colonizers of Hadley's Hope, a terraforming colony, become aware of the existence of nature's most ruthless and fiercest killing machines, the Xenomorphs. Anyone familiar with James Cameron's 1986 film Aliens would know that Hadley's Hope was located on an exomoon of a planet called Calpamus in the Zeta II Reticuli system in deep space. Sigourney Weaver's Ellen Ripley had returned to Earth after wandering for 57 years in stasis. After being found by the Weyland-Yutani guys, Ellen was sent back to Hadley's Hope to figure out why the contact was lost with the colony. Although the film did tell us about the Xenomorph attack on the crew, we learn a bit more about that in the Fire and Stone comics. Furthermore, there's much more than anyone could have anticipated. LV-426, also known as Acheron, was left devastated after the Xenomorph attack, but the colony was a huge one, and if a little girl like Newt could survive the acidic beasts, so could a few others.
Come on. Easy, easy.
I got her. Ow!
As the Xenomorphs came and started sticking their ugly teeth and tail into anything that moved, Derek Russell, the man in charge of Hadley's Hope, gathered a few others and decided to do something about the extremely deadly situation. He had been running the operation on Acheron or LV-426 for 4 years and was under the impression that he was doing his bit for humanity, that he was helping to build a better world. But the thing is, this guy did not watch Cameron's film and was unaware of just how grandly crappy Weyland-Yutani Corporation was. Nevertheless, Derek Russell gathers 3 other crew members and keeps on the move in the wake of the Xenomorph attack. While seeking safety, he comes across another party of survivors who were being led by Genevieve Dione, the greenhouse supervisor who moonlighted as a teacher for the colonists' children. But by now, the Xenomorphs had slaughtered or abducted almost everyone apart from this group of people. But being in charge of an entire colony had its perks. Derek had a workable plan that could ensure an escape from LV-426. There was no ship on the exomoon that could reach the desired speed to get back home, but that was not the priority right now. The priority was to survive long enough to make a plan about getting back to Earth. However, in order to do that, first they had to leave the ground. Derek's master plan included using a vessel called the Onager, and it was designed for drilling ore and ferrying it to low orbit, which meant that they could be in the air and away from the damned aliens. Meanwhile, Nolan Cale, the surveyor and prospector at Hadley's Hope, was loading some profitable cargo on the Onager. He was well aware of the risk he was taking, but some men value money more than anything else. But as was expected, the Xenomorphs attacked and slaughtered almost everyone. The high-end guns that Weyland-Yutani had provided its staff proved to be useless against against the monsters. When Derek and his people reached the hangar, things looked pretty bleak. Yet, there was no other choice for them apart from getting onto the Onaga. When Derek asked Kale if he got any supplies on board the Onaga, the man lied about his little side hustle, but thankfully he did get a transmitter and some emergency ration. Derek asked him to close the cargo hatches, and Kale left. Kale's assigned job was nothing less than a race against time, a ticking time bomb that could slice through him and the others. Through the radio, Derek said, "Kale, are we good? If need be, we can release the clamps on the cargo container, but then you'd have to stay behind." But Kale was no hero, right? He knew very well that the Xenomorphs had entered the cargo hold well before the Onaga took off. But despite seeing them get inside, he did not say anything, fearing that Derek would have uncoupled the cargo container, which would have meant that Kale would have been left back on Hadley's Hope with nothing to do but die. This one mistake of Kale's was going to cost everyone dearly. After much ado, the Onaga was up in space. Interestingly, LV-426 was one of the 3 moons of the planetoid called Calpamus. Their best chance was getting onto one of these moons and then sending a transmission back on Earth requesting evacuation. But getting to their destination was turning out to be like taking a walk through hell. The Onaga was not designed to carry almost 36 people from one exomoon to another. The crew was pushing the ship's limits. But then, it would have been a shit story if everyone just died in space, right? So the writers ensured that the Onaga reached LV-426's sister moon, LV-223. But Derek seemed surprised, rather shocked, to see the state of LV-223. He noted the company's records said this was a lifeless rock. It is not even supposed to have an atmosphere, but we're breathing. No matter how evil Weyland-Yutani was, the company aced in technology, and they wouldn't make a mistake about LV-223's geological conditions. Nevertheless, the crew came out of the crash-landed Onaga. Everyone was rather fine apart from Kale, who had been knocked unconscious because of the crash landing. Dione was tending to Kale, but she needed a med kit to be sure if he was really okay. Derek said that the supplies would be in the cargo hold, which was also supposed to house the transmitter. But now, Kale had gained consciousness and Derek asked his men to open up the cargo hold. Kale cried in fear, "No! Wait! Don't!" But it was too late. As soon as the hatches were opened, Xenomorphs came out screeching and screaming, looking to kill every human. As I mentioned earlier, Kale's mistake had become the cause of several lives lost. Derek and the others managed to split up and reach the high ground on the hills, and out of 38 people who boarded the Onaga, 6 were already dead within 10 minutes of setting foot on LV-223. Nevertheless, the survivors were deep into the woods and found themselves in relative safety. Derek asked his colleagues to get some rest. Even after seeing the things that he saw, Derek was hopeful of making out alive of LV-223. But the readers of the comic cannot help but feel pity for his naivety. Derek had little to no idea that the situation was going to exacerbate now. Issue 1 ends here, on a minor cliffhanger. But what lies ahead in Issue 2 blows everyone's mind. Let's find out, shall we? LV-223. 7 days later, on the 10th of July, Derek noticed a strange orb flying in the sky. He initially thought it was just a figment of his imagination, a hallucination that was caused by hunger and exhaustion. However, on the 19th of July, he once again noticed that same orb while escaping a Xenomorph horde. Derek knew that it was no imaginary orb but a piece of technology. By the end of July, he was able to track the orb's movements and calculate the intervals between its appearances. He spent the next few days building a makeshift net and finally managed to catch the flying orb. It turned out that it was an old Weyland-Yutani equipment. In reality, it was a perimeter uplink spectrograph, a 3D mapping device that was used by the crew of Elizabeth Shaw in Ridley Scott's film Prometheus. He learned that they were not the first humans to set foot on LV-223. A Weyland-Yutani crew had already come to the exomoon previously, but this was an answer that posed more questions. Back at the camp, the crew was divided into 2 parties. While Kale wanted to go back to the Onaga and retrieve the transmitter, Dione thought it was a terribly stupid idea to walk willingly into death's clutches. They were barely managing to hold things together, and acting like a raiding party should have been the last thing on the list. Dione knew that going back to the Onaga was suicide, and wanted to entrench where they were safe. She wanted to build up the defenses to fight the Xenomorphs, but Kale believed that they'd be sitting ducks. Interestingly, Nolan Kale had been someone who was only interested in profitable strikes than physical fights. But things change in the the face of desperate situations. Nevertheless, these arguments between Kale and Ione almost never reached any decisive end. Days turned into nights and nights turned into days, but the group of survivors was still stuck in that mysterious and hostile place. So, how were these people surviving on LV-223? Well, they had managed to discover edible flora and fauna on the harsh moon, but that was not it. They also found a strange black and oily liquid that Derek described as the stuff seemed to twist and mutate everything it touched. If we steered clear of it, we knew we would be able to keep from starving. Although Derek Russell did not know it yet, the stuff he was talking about was the black goo. It was essentially a potent liquid that had a genetic makeup of its own, but this was actually a pool of every genetic makeup there was. While some of them were terrestrial, the others were not. The liquid was extremely aggressive and transformed and mutated anything it came in contact with. However, later that night, the Xenomorphs attacked once again, killing several of the survivors. While Kale and Ione once again indulged in one of their argument sessions, Derek Russell started analyzing the orb he had found. He managed to access the probe's internal memory and was able to rig it to project everything it had recorded. After learning everything he could, Derek decided to tell his people about it. He tells them how the moon went through millions of years worth of evolution in less than a century. But this fact did not terrify him. Instead, he started to think about how valuable this discovery could be for humanity. He saw this accelerated evolution as celestial terraforming and wanted to find the technology through which such terraforming was achieved. But his audience was more interested in survival than a scientific breakthrough. At the pretense of scouting the terrain, Derek left and began his search for this extraordinary piece of technology that would revolutionize Earth. However, he was treading on a dangerous path. It wasn't long before he came across an engineer ship and terraforming array. For those who are new to the alien universe, engineers are the super species known to create several life forms, including human beings. Anyway, Derek learned that the ship had an engineer who was in hypersleep and the pod was operational. He knew that his crew would want nothing with another alien, but his discovery was too valuable and he did not want to let go of it. Therefore, he scavenged everything he could find, only to hide it in a cave on a hillside, and brought the rover with him. After a bit of tweaking, he was using the rover as a high-end journal. From this point onward, he would use the rover to record all his findings, thoughts, and musings. Meanwhile, Kale had taken few of his followers on the mission to retrieve the transmitter and supplies from the Onega. But as should be expected, the Xenomorphs attacked the men. They were rowing through a lake to reach the Onega, but a Xenomorph charged at them from what seemed to be a naturally formed bridge. One of the men, Louise, fell into the water, and the Xenomorph followed. Louise and the Xenomorph hit the bottom of the lake, which was filled with black goo. The next thing we know, Louise and the Xenomorph had merged together to give rise to a horrendous abomination. It turns out that the terraforming array that Derek had found was transforming the atmosphere of LV-223 into a breathable one. But additionally, the machines were also injecting the ground with the black goo. Kale managed to return to the crew, but the future seemed bleak. The Mutated Abominations. The third issue of the comic begins on October 30th, 2179. The men and women had been on the moon for almost 4 months now. You'd think that they must have gotten used to living in such a weird place, but they were not. However, every day was an adventure, albeit one that could turn fatal at any moment's notice. And likewise, the Louise Xenomorph creature attacked a small group of people. The creature would have gone on a rampage had it not been for Kale, who impaled its skull from behind. Kale had just killed one of his closest friends and was clearly morose. Ione forgot her differences with Kale and went up to him to console him. However, Kale had spent enough time keeping the secret with himself. It was because of him that the Xenomorphs had made their way to LV-223. In a moment of emotional vulnerability, he told everyone the truth about what had happened before they left Hadley's Hope. I knew those alien things got into the cargo hold of the Onega when we took off from Hadley's Hope. but he was scared of being left on LV-426 and kept the news from Derek and everyone else on the Onega. Dione punched the man down in anger and rage. "We could have been safe here. We could have been rescued by now. Instead, we're practically starving, forced to eat anything we find, while those aliens are picking us off one by one." But despite all the things Kale had seen and experienced, he wanted to return to the Onega. That's one dumb son of a snitch. Nevertheless, Derek found himself back in his cage, talking to his orb-cum-journal. Derek had begun to find answers to his million questions, but each answer seemed to pose two new questions. For starters, the jungle should not exist on a celestial object that was barren and uninhabitable just a century ago. So he knew that the terraforming array was at work trying to create a biosphere, but even with elite technology, it would take centuries to transform an entire moon. However, the transformation took little more than a few decades, and complex organisms came into existence in just another 3 to 4 decades. Furthermore, the mountain on which Derek was hiding was ever growing. We know that even in the real world, mountains keep growing. For instance, Mount Everest rises about 4 millimeters every year because the Indian continental plate is still creeping northward. Nevertheless, this mountain was not the result of two continental plates colliding with each other. As we learn from the comics titled Fire and Stone Omega, the mountain was a living being in itself and was ever evolving. Kale once again led a few men to the Onega, and this time they indeed reached the crashed ship. But just as they opened the ship's doors, they were shocked to their deaths to find a Xenomorph queen. By now she had laid several eggs, and her horde of worker Xenomorphs launched a scathing attack. Only Kale survived the assault and made it out of the Onega with the transmitter, but a Xenomorph attacked him and Kale dropped the transmitter into a pool of black goo, which caused the substance to splash on Kale's face. Meanwhile, Derek was learning more and more about the black goo. He couldn't decipher if the substance was artificial or natural, but it was clear that it had tremendous effects on living beings. Small amounts of the substance are enough to produce significant changes, while large amounts can transform someone or something into an entirely different creature. This was exactly what happened with Eldon in the comics Prometheus Fire and Stone. But then, the black goo was not entirely a mutagen. It was more of an accelerant that increased the pace of evolution and mutation. Meanwhile, Dione was worried as Kale hadn't returned from the Onega and she assumed he was dead. The survivors slept that night, falsely believing that the Xenomorphs had not found their camp. But a mutated Kale returned and with him came several Xenomorphs. And just like that, everyone was dead. Everyone but Derek Russell, who was hiding in that cave of his. Desperate times, desperate measures. Derek survived another few days and it was the 9th day of November. By now, he had found the downed ship from the film Prometheus and learned how exactly his rover came to LV-223. Derek wanted to salvage whatever he could from the wreck so he could build himself a pressurized suit and go beyond the jungle to learn more about the black goo. On November 12th, he left the safety of his cave and went to look for more clues. However, he gets attacked by a heavily mutated Kale who would have killed Derek had it not been for the Xenomorphs who distracted him. However, the Xenomorphs could have easily gotten Derek, but just as he reached the foot of the mountain, they stopped chasing him. It turns out that the ever-growing mountain was somehow protecting Derek. And yet again, Derek was left with several other questions. Why was the mountain trying to protect him? Nevertheless, he then returned to the alien ship, hoping to find the answers to his ever-growing list of questions. But the only answer he could figure out was that Kale must have been exposed to the black goo while he was in contact with one of the Xenomorphs. And naturally, Kale borrowed genetic material from the Xenomorph. And yet, Derek was super confused about everything that was going on. And he believed that the only way to get more answers was through waking up the engineer he had found in cryosleep. He tried his best to wake the engineer, even banged his head on the pod, but nothing happened. However, just as Derek turned around and started to walk away, the engineer's pod pinged. But Derek remained unaware of this fascinating new development. A few more days passed, and it was December 4th now. He had spent 5 months on the exomoon, and most of it he had spent alone in a cave with no one but a rover to talk to and nothing but alien flora and fauna to eat. Derek was finding it harder and harder to focus on his thoughts. He feared that he had come in direct contact with the black goo, or maybe he inhaled the black goo in particulate form. Not before long, Derek started experiencing severe headaches. It had become imperative that he found out what was happening to him. Being a man of science, he tweaked the rover a bit so that it could scan his body and found several black patches in his brain. Clearly, Derek was dying, but he was still unsure of the cause. Struggling with his constant headaches and his utter loneliness, Derek paid a visit to the graveyard that the crew had made for their dead. But he was ambushed by Kale, who had lost every bit of humanity by now and was nothing less than a humanoid xenomorph. And yet, Derek managed to kill Kale, but he himself had sustained fatal injuries. To make things worse, a horde of xenomorphs also made their presence known to Derek. He made a run towards the mountain, his savior, but he was too far from it. Derek made a run for it anyway, but he was well aware that he would not make it. As it happened, he stumbled upon a small puddle of black goo and remembered that although it was a volatile substance fraught with danger, the substance could accelerate someone's healing. It was a huge gamble, but Derek knew that coming in contact with the black goo was the only chance he had, and he took that chance. And that's where the story ends. It's not difficult to conclude that Derek Russell must have found the same fate as Kale and the others. Although Derek's life ended in this comic, his story went on to live in other comics of the Fire and Stone series, especially Prometheus, in which Francis Lane, the astrobiologist working for Weyland-Yutani, finds Derek's rover and other notes and learns about the various properties of the black goo. Francis would go on to inject the black goo into Eldon, and that led to the beginning of some really nasty things. If you want to learn more about Eldon, a synthetic construct who transformed into a conscious and largely moral but mutated monstrosity, you can check out our video titled Eldon Origin, Most Efficient Yautja and Xenomorph Killer, an almost unkillable mutated biosynthetic. We'll have a link in the description. And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one and be safe. Thanks everyone!